Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the Classroom Teacher Training course conducted by Madras Dyslexia Association. In this course, we are going to learn on how to help children with dyslexia. Previously, we have seen children who have not been performing to their potential in class and have been having difficulty in achieving success in their lives. The term dyslexia is now more well known, and we do have strategies and tools that can help the child. Today's session is going to deal on how to get into the world of the dyslexic child. My colleague Harini Mohan and myself are going to be talking to you on what are the symptoms that is manifested in this SLD child and how is it that we need to understand him. Having done this, the next segments will deal with all the strategies and tools. Can you please take us into this world of the dyslexic child and tell us exactly who he is?
Yes, sure. First, let's understand what is dyslexia. In dyslexia, the word dys refers to difficulty and lexia refers to language. So, dyslexia means having difficulty in processing a language. So, what is dyslexia exactly? It's a neurological condition or a disorder. Please remember, it's not a disease. The minute I say it's not a disease, there is no medication necessary or there is no medication available for it. It's just a condition. What makes it very difficult to identify is it's a hidden condition. You look at other types of disabilities and difficulties. The minute you look at the child, you can see some sort of manifestation outside. But as far as dyslexia is concerned, it's a hidden disability or a difficulty, if I have to put it that way, and there is absolutely no manifestation other than in academic areas. Disparity between ability level and performance. So what do I mean by saying ability? How do I determine the ability of a child? If these children are sent for an IQ test, these children will come out with flying colors, meaning their IQ will either start with 90% or it will only go up. In spite of which, they will have difficulties in performing their usual academic activities. It affects academic performance in about 10 to 15% of the school-going children. Let's understand this a little more. That means out of every 100 children who go to school, there are 10 to 15% of them who have this condition called dyslexia. But the degree of dyslexia might vary from child to child.
So Harini, can you please explain exactly what do we mean by the various degrees of dyslexia?
Sure, Vilasini. When we talk of degrees of dyslexia, we're going to put the whole dyslexic children into 3 different groups. The first one is called as the mildly dyslexic children, the second group as moderately dyslexic children, and the third group as severely dyslexic children. But let us remember, we can't quantify and say that a child is 20% dyslexic or 30% dyslexic. Now, why do we have to distinguish or differentiate as mildly dyslexic, moderately dyslexic, and severely dyslexic? It's extremely important because if a child is mildly dyslexic, all that the child requires is some understanding by the teacher who can give classroom accommodation and help during school hours inside the classroom itself. For some reason, if a child who is mildly dyslexic is not identified and not helped, he moves into the next group. So, what do I mean by saying moving into the next group? When a child is mildly dyslexic, let us assume that he is supposed to be here as far as skill level is concerned, but his actual skill, when tested, will be a little lower. That means the gap between what is expected out of him and where he is very minimal, and hence it becomes easy for a teacher to give some bit of help inside the classroom, and she tries to bridge the gap. But in case if this is not done, what happens? The gap widens because the child's skill level still stays in the same place, but the demand from him keeps moving up. So the gap widens, and hence it may not be possible for a class teacher to just give classroom accommodation. I'm not saying the teacher cannot give classroom accommodation, but whatever help the teacher gives may not be sufficient for the child to really bridge the gap. So what is the sort of help that we need to give to a child at that time? The child may have to go to a special educator or a teacher after school hours, maybe twice, thrice or 4 times a week, depending upon what is his necessity. That will help him to bridge the gap between where he is and where he has to be. In case, for some reason, if the child is not helped, then he becomes severely dyslexic. So what is meant by the severely dyslexic? That means the gap has become even more. That means even by giving him help after school hour, it's not going to help the child to bridge the gap. Then there might be a possibility that you've got to pull him out of mainstream curriculum and then put him in a learning center or with a special educator, maybe for about a year or two, so that he develops his skill and then he gets back into the mainstream curriculum. Hence, it's extremely important for each and every one of us to understand this condition and start identifying these children at a very young age and give them the timely intervention.
So, Harini, you've just now told us that you can help the child after school for children who are moderately or mildly dyslexic, and with the severe dyslexic child, he needs more intensive remediation. Looking at it from the point of view of the child's life, would you consider that dyslexia is something that is short-lived, or is it something that's going to be with the child for his life?
So, it's a lifelong condition. It's not something that you can take away. Let's understand what happens exactly. Where is the problem? The problem is more in the neural connection or the network that you see inside your brain. It has nothing to do with the strength of the nerves, but the connection is where there is a difference. So, when we give remedial help, by remedial help, I'm talking of identifying the child at a very young age and then giving him the systematic remedial education. We are only going to help the child to overcome the difficulty that this condition gives. Difficulty in academic areas to start with, but later on it will come up in certain other areas too. Over here, let us remember, we can always help this child who's dyslexic or an adult who's dyslexic to overcome the difficulties that come out of this condition, but you can never reverse the condition. So, it is a lifelong neurological condition.
Is it also true that we can say that if you give the child the strategies to overcome or to cope with his problems, then as he grows up and as he faces newer problems, he's able to overcome these because the strategies have already been given in early childhood or in the early intervention. So, though he may have lifelong conditions, or though dyslexia may be something that's going to be with him for the rest of his life, he is going to be able to cope and manage.
Yes, it's very much possible, and that is the whole idea of talking a lot about dyslexia and also talking about the coping strategy that we can give these two children. We can give to these children. It's very, very important that we give them the coping strategy as early as possible. We are not saying that the difficulty will not come up, but the children know how to cope with the difficulties that come up as and when it comes up. So, dyslexia refers to processing difficulty. Now, let's look into what are the various types of processing difficulties that we see in children. Vilasni, could you please tell us what is visual processing difficulty?
Yes. Now, visual processing difficulty is the difficulty with making sense of exactly what you see. Now you are getting a visual input. Now you need to process that input to make a meaning out of it. This is a very important aspect of learning or reading or any processing, in fact, for life. This visual processing difficulties fall into some subcategories. For instance, the visual discrimination difficulty. Now, what do we mean by that? When I talk about discrimination, I am talking about looking at the fine difference between similar looking letters or objects. Child with visual processing difficulty will often have the BD reversals in reading or writing or spelling, or the P and Q reversals. Manifestation of the visual processing difficulty is mostly seen in academic areas, but it does exist in other areas as well. The next subcategory of visual processing difficulty is the visual figure ground difficulty. By this, we mean the ability to pick out one particular object in a background of many objects. How does this manifest in classroom? When you have a board with full of written materials, the child finds it difficult to find that one word where he has to copy, or he may find it difficult to identify that one particular main idea in a lesson. So these are the difficulties that shows that the child is having visual figure ground difficulties. Visual motor difficulties. The integration of what we have seen along with our motor movements, that is what we mean by visual motor difficulties. Now, board copying exercise in a classroom situation is literally a fine example of visual motor difficulty. He needs to see the words on the board, and with his fine motor skills or with his hand and pencil tool, he has to copy it and write it out. This eye-hand movement is what we call the visual motor difficulty, and it is an important processing ability that the child should have.
Okay. Is there any other type of difficulty or a subcategory that you see in visual processing, Vilasini?
There are three more difficulty subcategories. The visual spatial difficulty. Now, the ability to find a sense of the object in space, that is your visual spatial difficulty. Now, manifestation in the classroom would be in the form of writing a word on a line, or finding and locating the answer in a text. So it is important to have the spatial ability, and the visual spatial ability is a combination of a visual processing along with the spatial ability. We also have the visual closure ability. Now, closure as we know it is completing one object by filling in the missing part. It can be an object, it can be a drawing, it can even be a sentence. A child with difficulties in the visual closure will find it difficult to identify a car if the wheels have not been drawn. So when there is a missing part, he is not able to fill up that missing part to make the whole. And finally, the visual sequential ability. Now that is so important because, as we know, everything that we do is in sequence. We have our alphabet said in sequence, we have our spelling in a particularly sequential way, we have our numbers which are also in sequence. So that ability is a required pre-existing skill which the child must have in order to be able to process what he sees. So the visual processing ability is a very fine but most critical aspect of a child, or in fact any person, when he is seeing anything that he has to do in life.
Yes, visual processing is so important for a child to do extremely well in a classroom. Similarly, auditory processing is also extremely important. Could you please tell us the various types of auditory processing difficulties that a child could have?
Certainly. Auditory processing is as important as your visual processing. Now, auditory processing, by we mean that the child has to make sense of whatever he hears. Now, his hearing capacity is absolutely fine, but what he needs to do is to make sense of what he has heard. So, auditory processing difficulty can hamper his learning or performance in class. Again, here also we have categories of the difficulties. The first one being auditory hypersensitivity. When we say hypersensitivity, automatically means that the child is unable to take loud sounds, or when there are several sounds coming in together, especially in a classroom situation where you have the children making noise, the teacher talking, and perhaps something happening around the classroom, the child cannot process anything and has a major confusion in that. So he is generally stopped processing auditorily completely.
You mean to say that they are not able to filter out the other sounds that you hear?
They are not able to. Absolutely, they can't filter out the other sounds at all. For them, it's all just one big noise. So it doesn't make sense. So then learning doesn't happen. So that what would the teacher say? That you're not listening to me, or you're not paying attention. But the fact is that there are so many sounds coming in, and the child who is auditory hypersensitive then is not able to listen to any one of those. Then we have the phonetic decoding. Now, the phonetic decoding is where the child is unable to make out the sounds in the language. Language is full of sounds, and in order to be able to read, to spell, to write, you need to decode that language. Where the child is not able to do it listening, then he finds it difficult later on in the visual and maybe even in the writing. So the auditory phonetic decoding is absolutely essential. We have auditory integration. Again, you have decoded the sounds. You have made sense of what you're hearing. But you need to put those sounds together to be able to make it into a sensible word or language. So auditory integration and decoding go hand in hand, right? Then we have the prosodic difficulty. Now that is something that happens to every one of us. Yes. When we hear lots of sounds, our capacity to think in our minds comes down. For a dyslexic child or for a child with SLD, this difficulty is highlighted because when he hears a couple of sounds together, he is unable to think. So then again, what will happen is that it affects his performance in the classroom.
So could you tell us more about the phonological processing difficulties that they have?
Absolutely. Again, it's just a third step in the progression of difficulties. Phonological processing is the ability to process the sounds in the language and to make sense of it. Now, when we have reading, it goes into a lot of reading aspect and spelling aspect. The first subcategory of phonological processing is the phonemic awareness. Now, the phonemic awareness is the capacity to manipulate the sounds that you find in a word so that you are able to read fluently. This ability is important, so that is where most often we find that when we have started the remedial teaching, something that we're going to go into a little later, we talk about starting first with phonemic awareness activity. One of the most important activities, so a subcategory of phonological processing would be phonemic awareness. The other subcategory for phonological processing is the phonological working memory. Now, when we talk later on, I think Harini, you can take us on this explanation about memory.
Yes,
working memory is important, and the ability to remember the sounds at that instant so that you can make the words is an important subcategory of the phonological processing. Phonological retrieval is as equally important as the others, because you may have the memory, you may have the awareness, but you must be able to retrieve it, and especially on demand which is difficult for the child. So, apart from the difficulties that we see in the processing, there are two other difficulties, especially what we call the executive functions disability. Harini, please explain to us exactly what we mean by executive functions.
Sure, Vilasini. Before that, I would also like to tell you all that when we have a child with visual processing difficulty or an auditory processing difficulty, we are not talking of children having problems in their eyes or eyesight. It is not anything to do with the physical part of your eye. It's something that happens after the eyes send in proper input to your brain. Same way, when we talk of a child who has auditory processing difficulty, most often or in all the cases, their ears would be perfectly fine. When they are taken to a ENT doctor, the doctor would give a certificate saying that his hearing is perfectly fine or his ears are perfectly fine, but still would have auditory processing problem. Once we come across a child with severe auditory processing problem, it is always better to take them to a speech and audiologist rather than to an ENT doctor. Now, Vilasini was talking about executive dysfunction. There are 8 types of executive dysfunction, starting from shift, planning, prioritizing, emotional control, behavior control, memory, and there are 2 other things which are not that relevant. So let us talk of few executive dysfunction that are very, very relevant for a school-going child. Planning, prioritizing, or I would also use the word management. So what are the various types of management that is involved? First is time management. Here is a child who does not have a concept of time. I am not talking of simple time management problem. All of us have time management issues. Maybe because of factors that can be controlled by us, or maybe because of certain external factors. We've always been a little late for a particular program. But where is the difference? Whenever we go, we are very apologetic because we know, we are aware that we are late for a particular program. But we do come across certain children who say they want to use the washroom or they walk in 5 full minutes after the bell, but they are not even aware. How do we say that the child is not aware? It's by the body language. They don't say sorry, they walk in straight and try to go and sit in a place. So what do we say? We just keep telling the children that they are late and then we want the child to apologize. The child might even apologize without even knowing that he's been a little late or without being aware that he's a little late. So what will happen to a child like that? The child is bound to repeat it on all the consecutive days. And unfortunately, when we don't understand this as a time management problem, we often call them as children who do not want to listen to us or who do not want to respect our words. What happens to this child in an exam? I know this particular child always submits the paper without completing it. So I make a note of it and I go stand next to the child and say, hey, you have only 10 minutes and you have 4 answers to write. The child might just look up at you and may not increase the speed, not because he does not know or not because he does not want to complete, mainly because he does not know what is this 10 minutes. Can he finish these 4 answers in a span of 10 minutes? So that understanding of time per se, more the time sense is what we are talking about. That is where some of these children could have difficulties. The next one is your material management. Some of the children do not bring their notebooks to school. You keep telling them repeatedly that they have to bring their science notebook. They bring their notebook, but it is not their science notebook. It could be their social notebook or it could be their English notebook. Most often, a child who goes to an English medium school could have difficulties in differentiating between science, social and English. That is mainly because the minute they open the notebook to see, it's the same type of figures or the structures that you see and they're not able to really read through and understand. At this point of time, let us remember that dyslexic children always think in terms of pictures. That means A is a picture for them and B is a picture for them and C is another picture for them. So when they open the notebook, it's just a group of pictures put together, be it science, be it social or be it English, and hence they are not really able to differentiate. Unfortunately, in these days, school insists on using the same brown cover and the same label. We don't understand that these children can't differentiate. Is there?
So a color coding will help the child
Yes,
a great deal.
Yes, color coding will definitely help the child. What is it that we can do? How can we color? Take a nice big label and put it on the notebook on all the sides. That means if the child takes out the notebook, the color should be visible. One more thing we need to remember when we use color code is once we allot a particular color to a
Yes.
particular subject, it has to be followed. The same color has to be followed till the end. We can't keep changing colors. So, Vilasni, it becomes very important for all the teachers to sit together and decide on the colors
Colors
that
scheme.
they want to
Yes.
use. The next difficulty that you could see is spatial difficulty.
Yeah.
Yes. What is spatial difficulty? Vilasni, can you take us through what is meant by spatial
Spatial
difficulty?
difficulty is simply knowing yourself with respect to the space around you. There is a lot of judgment required for spatial ability, and that is something that the dyslexic child will find it difficult because he is unable to judge. If I am standing here and there is a table there, that I need to go in between the table and perhaps another table without banging on it or without hitting on it. So that spatial difficulty, that planning that is there in the mind on exactly how I should make my steps go between the two tables, that is the spatial ability that requires again planning and hence it's the executive functioning.
Yes. So, children with spatial management problem will have difficulties both in non-academic areas as well as in their academic areas. First, let's talk of non-academic areas. These are children who are generally very clumsy. They keep knocking things down. They go bang against something forever. You could also see another type of difficulty or manifestation in classroom. They take their bag and they don't know that they have to move only a little bit to put their bag on their back, and they could move a lot more. What will happen? It'll go and hit another child, and that child keeps complaining. This is one of the general things that you will see. In academic areas, everything and whatever you do involves a lot of spatial arrangement, thinking and management. Let's talk of handwriting. One instruction that we keep giving children is maintain one finger space between words. Most children will actually keep their finger for the initial 1 week or so when they start writing sentences, after which they are able to estimate what is this one finger space. But children with extreme spatial management problem may not be able to estimate this finger space, and hence they might put all the words together. It is a difficulty that they have and they are not doing it deliberately. Over here, we need to do something to help them overcome the spatial difficulty or spatial management problem rather than giving them general oral instruction. Another area where you will definitely see a lot of issues or problem is in math. Think of geometry. It involves a lot of space. They do not know, as far as geometry is concerned, they don't know whether to start in the middle of the page or start from the bottom or start from the top. You need to keep changing it depending upon the height of a triangle, for example. But these children may find it difficult. They may not be able to do it. Map work. You give them a map. They don't know where to start and where to end. And there is a possibility that you will have Pacific Ocean marked next to India, not because they do not know the concept that Pacific Ocean is not next to India, mainly because they do not know with the given complete space of an open map without any marking where to start and where to go. So these are some of the manifestations that you will see with a child who has difficulties in spatial management. Okay. The next one of the executive dysfunction where these children could have difficulties is the thought management. they're not able to manage their thoughts really well. It's extremely important for them to manage their thoughts, meaning thoughts that are relevant to a particular topic that they are expected to write and give it a good structure. Otherwise, they might not be able to cover all the points, or they might not be able to present it really well. The last one that we see is memory. Memory per se might look like it is a problem. You ask them for an answer that they learned 2 days back, they may not be able to give out the answers. But ask them about a movie dialogue that they saw 2 years back, they'll be able to give you verbatim. This leaves us a little zapped. Where is the difficulty? Or is he doing deliberately? Is the sort of feeling that we might get. Let us understand the types of memory based on time span. The first is short-term memory and the next is long-term memory. Anything and everything, when we put it into our mind or when we learn it or when we hear it for the first time, always goes into short-term memory. But from there, unless you consciously shift to long-term memory, it gets deleted because the capacity of a short-term memory is pretty limited. Let's take an example of learning 6 answers. If the child learns answer number 1 and 2 on day 1, and on day 2, if the child goes on to learn answer number 3 and 4 without pushing it to long-term memory, 1 and 2 might just look a little familiar, whereas 3 and 4 will be very, very fresh because that's where the short-term memory is. Unless the child pushes this 3 and 4 again to the long-term memory, and if the child goes on to learn answer 5 and 6, 1 and 2 would be completely lost, meaning the child won't remember anything at all. Answer number 3 and 4, the child will remember little bit, not the entire answer that he's learned, but he will remember answer 5 and 6. So how do we stop this happening? What should be done? Something has to be done to keep pushing the content that is there in the short-term memory into the long-term memory. Most of us, what we do is we learn, we relearn, we revise. So what do? We keep it actively in our mind and we manipulate it or we do something, and hence the content is pushed from short-term memory to the long-term memory. This is called as your active working memory, meaning it is the memory which is sort of in between your short-term and long-term, but which is extremely important for the content to be sent to the long-term memory. So these children, when I talk of these children, I am talking of children with dyslexia may not be able to push content from short-term to long-term memory because their active working memory is not as it is for any of us. They need certain other ways of learning or to push the content from short-term memory to long-term memory. Or in other words, their active working memory works a little differently. They need certain study skills, color coding, visualizing and verbalizing to push the content from the short-term memory to long-term memory. Then how is it that they are able to remember movies? That is because movies actually resort to multi-sensory approach and a lot of colors through which it gets transferred. That means it caters to the active working memory the way it works for all these children, and hence they remember things for a very, very long time.
So Harini, we have seen now how there is a visual processing difficulty, an auditory processing difficulty, a phonological awareness difficulty, executive dysfunctions and memory. Altogether, when there is a difficulty in any of these areas, either in isolation or in combination, this leads to a slow processing speed, and this affects the ability of the child to perform in a classroom and to achieve success. We've come to the end of the first segment. In the next segment, we'll talk about other coexisting conditions along with dyslexia and the skills that are affected by the dyslexics.